A widow was walking with her son when she saw a man exactly like her late husband enter a luxury store. As she approached to check, her whole body began to tremble. In the exuberant Walker mansion in Beverly Hills, the afternoon sun painted the sky with golden tones, and Genevieve, a young widow of 32 years, played happily with her son Nathan, an 8-year-old boy full of energy and with a contagious smile. Their laughter echoed through the air, a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere that seemed to envelop the imposing house. Mr. Franklin Walker, a 70-year-old man with grey hair and an aristocratic bearing, observed the scene from the terrace, his face marked by worry lines and eyes that carried the weight of long-hidden secrets. His gaze alternated between tenderness when seeing his grandson and anxiety when contemplating Genevieve, as if he feared that at any moment she might discover something he struggled to keep hidden. "Grandpa, why don't you come play with us?" Nathan shouted, waving enthusiastically at Mr. Franklin. The old patriarch forced a smile, but his eyes betrayed a deep sadness. Genevieve, sensing the melancholy in her father-in-law's gaze, decided to approach. She climbed the stairs to the terrace. As she reached Mr. Franklin, she noticed how his shoulders seemed weighed down, as if an invisible burden pressed upon him. The death of Caleb, her beloved husband, and Mr. Franklin's son still hovered over them like a dark cloud, a wound that seemed never to completely heal. Genevieve, in her compassionate nature, felt a wave of empathy for the man who, despite his wealth and power, seemed so fragile in that moment. "Mr. Franklin," she began, her voice soft but laden with emotion, "I know it's difficult, but seeing Nathan makes me think, isn't it terrible to have only one child and lose him? Have you never thought of having another?" The effect of Genevieve's words was immediate and shocking. Mr. Franklin's face, normally a mask of control and composure, contorted into an expression of barely disguised panic. His eyes widened, and for a moment it seemed he had stopped breathing. It was as if Genevieve's words had touched on a deep, secret wound, something Mr. Franklin was desperately struggling to keep hidden. "Another child? No, Genevieve. Caleb was enough," he stammered, his voice trembling slightly. "But tell me, how are Nathan's studies going? Does he need any additional tutors?" Genevieve, surprised by the abrupt change of subject and Mr. Franklin's exaggerated reaction, felt a chill run down her spine. There was something about that reaction, something in the way his eyes shifted nervously, avoiding her gaze, that sparked a flicker of suspicion in her heart. She had known Mr. Franklin for years, and had never seen him lose his composure in such a way. What could be so terrible as to leave the powerful Walker patriarch so visibly shaken? Genevieve opened her mouth to question further, but Mr. Franklin was already moving, his words coming rushed and almost incoherent. "It's getting cold, don't you think? We'd better go inside. Nathan could catch a cold," he said, already heading for the door, his steps hurried and anxious. Genevieve followed him, her mind swirling with unformed questions. As they walked inside the mansion, she couldn't help but notice how tense Mr. Franklin's shoulders were, as if he carried the weight of the world. Whatever it was he was hiding, it was clear it consumed him from the inside. And in that moment, watching the man she had always seen as a pillar of strength move as if fleeing from invisible ghosts, Genevieve made a silent promise to herself. She would uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "There are secrets in this house," she thought, her heart racing at the prospect of the mystery unfolding before her. "And for Nathan's sake, for Caleb's memory, I will find out what is going on here." The next day, the morning in Beverly Hills dawned with the promise of intense heat, typical of the Mexican summer. The sun was already shining brightly when Genevieve and Nathan left the Walker mansion, the shadow of the previous day's conversation still hovering over them like an invisible cloud. Genevieve, dressed in a simple but elegant dress, held Nathan's hand firmly, as he skipped animatedly by her side. She had decided to take her son for a stroll through the city's upscale shopping mall, an attempt to push aside the somber thoughts that had been tormenting her since Mr. Franklin's strange reaction. "Mum, can we go to the toy store first?" Nathan asked, his eyes shining with expectation. Genevieve smiled, stroking her son's hair. "Of course, my love, but first, I have to do some shopping for the house." As they walked through the gleaming corridors of the mall, Genevieve couldn't help but notice the contrast between the luxury around her and the simplicity of her own life. Since Caleb's death, she and Nathan had depended on Mr. Franklin's generosity, a situation that made her uncomfortable, especially now that she suspected her father-in-law was hiding something. Her eyes wandered distractedly past the storefronts, her mind still lost in conjecture about what could be so terrible as to shake the imposing Walker patriarch. "Look, Mom, what beautiful watches," Nathan exclaimed, pointing to the window display of a luxury jewelry store. Genevieve smiled, leaning in to look. "They are beautiful, my dear. Maybe when you're older." That was when Genevieve's world stopped. There, reflected in the shop window, was a face she knew better than her own, a face she had cried over, kissed, and last seen pale and motionless in a coffin. Caleb. Her heart began to race, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. She turned slowly, fearing the vision would disappear, that it was merely a cruel trick of her longing mind. But it was no illusion. A few meters away, dressed in an elegant suit she had never seen him wear, was a man identical to Caleb. Every detail, from the way his hair fell over his forehead to his gait, was a perfect replica of her late husband. Genevieve felt her legs weaken, and she had to lean against the window to keep from falling. "It can't be. It's not possible," she murmured, her voice trembling with emotion. Nathan, sensing the sudden change in his mother, tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, what's wrong? You're pale." Genevieve couldn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the man, who was now approaching the jewelry store. She watched, paralyzed, as he passed them, so close she could have reached out and touched his arm. The scent of his cologne, the same one Caleb had always worn, invaded her senses, bringing back an avalanche of memories. "Dad?" Nathan's voice, full of confusion and hope, cut through the silence. The boy had also noticed the striking resemblance. Genevieve squeezed her son's hand, unable to find words to explain the inexplicable. The man paused at the jewelry store entrance, turning slightly to glance at a watch on display. At that moment, Genevieve could clearly see his profile, and the likeness was even more shocking. Every line of his face, every expression, was an exact copy of Caleb's. She felt her heart break and reassemble itself in a matter of seconds, a mixture of pain, hope, and bewilderment taking hold. "Nathan," she finally managed to say, her voice little more than a whisper, "stay here for a moment. Don't move." The boy nodded, his wide eyes still fixed on the man who was the spitting image of his father. With trembling steps, Genevieve began to approach the jewelry store. Her mind spun with impossible possibilities. Could it be that Caleb hadn't died? That it had all been a terrible mistake? Or was she simply losing her mind, seeing ghosts where there were none? Every step seemed to bring her closer to a truth she feared, but one she also desperately longed to uncover. The man entered the jewelry store, and Genevieve paused at the entrance, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone around could hear it. Through the glass, she watched as he approached the counter, conversing with the salesman with a familiarity that surprised her. His smile, his gestures, everything was so Caleb that it hurt. "Ma'am, can I help you?" The store security guard's voice snapped her out of her trance. Genevieve blinked, realizing she was standing at the entrance, blocking the way. I just... Unable to form a coherent sentence, Genevieve stepped back. She needed to think, needed to understand what was happening. She quickly returned to where Nathan waited, her eyes never leaving the figure of the man inside the store. "Mom, is that man Dad?" Nathan asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Genevieve knelt beside her son, taking his hands in hers. "I don't know, my love, but we're going to find out." With a determination she didn't know she possessed, Genevieve made a decision. They were going to follow that man, find out who he was and why he was identical to Caleb. She knew it could be dangerous, that she might be deluding herself, but the need to know the truth was stronger than any fear or doubt. "Nathan, listen to me carefully," she said, looking into her son's eyes. "We're going to follow that man, but you have to be very quiet and do exactly as I say. Understood?" The boy nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the situation. Genevieve stood up, holding Nathan's hand firmly. Her eyes never left the figure of the man inside the jewelry store, who was now examining a diamond necklace. She felt a pang in her heart as she remembered Caleb always saying he would one day give her a necklace like that. Whoever he is, Genevieve thought, her determination growing by the second. I'll find out the truth. For Nathan, for Mr. Franklin, for myself. The man was finishing his purchase. Genevieve felt her heart race. Genevieve felt the world spin around her as she approached the entrance to the jewelry store. The man who was the living image of Caleb was about to leave, the store's bag swinging gently in his hand. Her heart was pounding so hard it seemed ready to burst from her chest. Nathan, sensing his mother's tension, squeezed her hand tighter. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly, "are you really going to do this?" Genevieve looked at her son, seeing in him the same courage she had always admired in Caleb. She took a deep breath, gathering all the strength she could. "Yes, my son. We need to know the truth." With hesitant steps, they approached the man. Genevieve could feel every beat of her heart, every shallow breath. The world around her seemed to have slowed down, each second stretching into eternity. She observed every detail of the man, the way his hair fell over his forehead, just like Caleb's, the elegant, confident posture she knew so well. Even the way he held the jewelry store bag was identical to her late husband's. When they were just a few steps away, Genevieve summoned all her courage and called out, "Excuse me, sir." The man turned around, and Genevieve felt like she had been punched in the stomach. It was like looking at a ghost. Every line of his face, every expression, was a perfect replica of Caleb's. For a moment she forgot how to breathe. The man, noticing the obvious shock on Genevieve and Nathan's faces, frowned in confusion. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, his voice so familiar that Genevieve felt tears form in her eyes. It was at that moment that Nathan, unable to contain his emotion, took a step forward. His eyes were wide, a mixture of hope and fear shining in their childlike depths. With a trembling voice that seemed to carry all the weight of his loss and all the longing of his young heart, he uttered a single word, "Dad." The effect was instantaneous. The man recoiled as if he had been shocked, his eyes widening in an expression of pure shock and confusion. He quickly looked from Nathan to Genevieve and back to Nathan, as if he were trying to understand what was happening. I don't," he stammered, clearly shaken by the unexpected situation. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Genevieve, finally finding her voice, took a step forward. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "Please, sir, I know this must seem like madness, but are you Caleb Walker, my husband?" The man blinked several times as if he were trying to process the question. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No, ma'am. My name is Miles Harrington. I'm not who you think I am." Genevieve felt her heart sink. Part of her had hoped, against all logic, that this man would turn out to be Caleb, that it was all just a terrible misunderstanding. But another part, the part that had mourned the loss of her husband for so long, knew it was impossible. But you're identical to him," she insisted, her voice fraught with emotion. "Every detail, every gesture. How is that possible?" Miles looked increasingly uncomfortable. He cast a nervous glance around as if searching for an escape route. "Ma'am, I assure you I have no connection to your husband or the Walker family. It must be a coincidence." Nathan, who had remained silent until then, suddenly spoke up again. His voice was small but filled with a surprising determination for one so young. "But you have the same birthmark as Dad right here." He pointed to a specific spot on Miles's neck. The man instinctively brought his hand to the indicated spot, his eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, he seemed to lose his composure, a flicker of something, fear, recognition passing through his eyes. Genevieve, perceiving the subtle change in Miles' expression, took another step forward. "Please, Mr. Harrington, if you know anything at all about my husband, about Caleb, I beg you to tell us. We've suffered so much." Miles seemed to waver for a moment, his eyes softening with what looked like compassion. But then, as quickly as it appeared, the expression was gone, replaced by a mask of polished indifference. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am," he said, his voice controlled, but not entirely devoid of emotion. "But I assure you I have no relation to your family. It must be an extraordinary coincidence." Genevieve felt a wave of despair wash over her. She knew, deep in her heart, that there was more to this story. The resemblance was simply too great to be a mere coincidence. How could she let this opportunity slip away? "Mr. Harrington," She tried again, her voice laden with pleading. "I understand that this must be uncomfortable for you. But please try to understand. My son grew up without his father. I spent countless nights crying for my husband. If there's anything at all, you can tell us." Miles seemed to waver again. For a brief moment, Genevieve thought she saw a flicker of pain in his eyes, as if he too was struggling against some kind of internal anguish. But then, as quickly as it appeared, the expression was gone. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I can't help you. I wish you well, but I must be going now." With that, Miles abruptly turned, almost running toward the exit of the jewelry store. Genevieve and Nathan stood watching his figure rapidly disappear, blending into the crowd at the mall. "Mum," Nathan said softly, tugging at Genevieve's sleeve. "Why did he run away? Did we do something wrong?" Genevieve hugged her son, her own emotions swirling. "No, sweetheart, we didn't do anything wrong, but I think Mr. Harrington knows more than he's telling us." As she watched Miles' figure vanish into the crowd, Genevieve felt a mix of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to run after him, demand answers, force him to tell the truth she knew he was hiding. But another part, the part that had learned to be cautious after so much suffering, held her back. "What do we do now, Mom?" Nathan asked, his voice small but filled with a surprising determination. Genevieve looked at her son, seeing in him the same strength she had always admired in Caleb. With a deep sigh, she made a decision. "Now, sweetheart, we're going to find out the truth. Whatever Mr. Harrington is hiding, we're going to uncover it." They exited the jewelry store, the world around them seeming strangely normal after the surreal encounter. Genevieve couldn't help but notice how people passed them by, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. To the rest of the world, it was just another ordinary day, but for her and Nathan, everything had changed. "Mom," Nathan said, breaking the silence as they walked, "do you think Mr. Harrington could really be Dad?" Genevieve hesitated, not wanting to give her son false hope, but also not wanting to dismiss the possibility entirely. "I don't know, sweetheart. The resemblance is uncanny, but your father passed away. We saw him. We were at his funeral." Nathan nodded slowly, processing his mother's words. But what if it was a mistake? What if Dad had to pretend his death for some reason? Nathan's words echoed the thoughts Genevieve was trying to suppress. It was a crazy, impossible idea. And yet, the resemblance was undeniable, the birthmark on the neck that Nathan had noticed. How could that be explained? "Nathan," Genevieve said, stopping and kneeling down to meet her son's eyes. "Listen carefully. We don't know what's going on, but I promise we'll get to the bottom of this. However, we can't cling to false hopes. We have to be strong and face reality, whatever it may be." Nathan nodded, his eyes shining with a mixture of hope and fear. "I understand, Mom, but I can't help feeling that Dad is somehow connected to all of this." Genevieve hugged her son, feeling the weight of his words. She couldn't help feeling that way either, no matter how irrational it seemed. "I know, my love. I know." As they walked back home, Genevieve couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Franklin and his strange reaction the day before. Could there be a connection? Did the Walker patriarch know more than he was saying? There are secrets in this family, Genevieve thought, her determination growing with every step. And for Nathan's sake, for Caleb's memory, I will uncover the truth, no matter what. Night fell over the Walker mansion, enveloping it in shadows that seemed to hold long-buried secrets. In the kitchen, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp, Genevieve sat at the table, surrounded by family albums. Her eyes scanned the yellowed pages, desperately seeking any clue that could explain the inexplicable encounter that afternoon. Caleb's smiling photos gazed back at her, so familiar and yet so enigmatic now. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned each page, as if afraid of what she might discover. "Why, Caleb?" she murmured to herself, her voice thick with emotion. "What secrets were you keeping, my love?" Nathan, sitting beside his mother, watched with curious and concerned eyes. The boy, so young and already carrying the weight of so many uncertainties, finally broke the tense silence that hung over the kitchen. "Mom, do you think that man at the jewelry store could really be Dad?" he asked, his large eyes filled with hope fixed on Genevieve's face. Genevieve sighed deeply, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know, my love," she replied, gently stroking her son's hair. but I promise we'll find out the truth, whatever it is." She continued to flip through the albums, her trembling hands caressing the photographs, as if they could extract from them the answers she so desperately sought. Every image of Caleb was like a stab to her heart, the resemblance to the man from the jewelry store so evident, it was almost painful. Suddenly, she stopped at one particular photo, one that showed Caleb as a baby in Mr. Franklin's arms. "Nathan, look at this," she said, pointing to the photo. "Doesn't it seem like there's something strange about this image?" The boy leaned in to take a closer look, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "It looks like there's a shadow behind Grandpa," he replied, his voice filled with curiosity, like there was someone else there. Genevieve felt a chill run down her spine. How had she never noticed this before? Her eyes scrutinized the photo more closely, trying to discern what that mysterious shadow could be. Could it be possible that... Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. Genevieve and Nathan looked up in alert, their bodies tense with anticipation. The kitchen door opened slowly, revealing the imposing figure of Mr. Franklin. The Walker patriarch stopped abruptly at the sight before him. Genevieve and Nathan hunched over the family albums, the table covered in photographs and memories of the past. His eyes widened slightly, a mixture of surprise and apprehension crossing his weathered face. "What are you doing?" Mr. Franklin asked, his voice a blend of curiosity and caution. Genevieve felt her heart race. It was now or never. She rose slowly, her eyes never leaving Mr. Franklin's. The air in the kitchen seemed to have grown thicker, laden with tension and secrets about to be revealed. "Mr. Franklin," she began, her voice quivering slightly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something happened today that I can't explain." The old patriarch raised an eyebrow, his face a mask of forced calm. "What is it, Genevieve?" Genevieve took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. The words she had so feared uttering finally left her lips. "Today, at a jewelry store, Nathan and I saw a man identical to Caleb." Mr. Franklin stood motionless, his face a mask of stone, but Genevieve could see the fear growing in his eyes. She continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "His name is Miles Harrington. And the strangest thing is, he has the same birthmark as Caleb in the same place on his neck." The effect was immediate and shocking. Mr. Franklin visibly paled, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His eyes, normally cold and controlled, were now wide with an expression of pure panic. "No, I don't know what you're talking about, Genevieve," he stammered, his voice trembling in a way Genevieve had never heard before. "People can look alike. It must be a coincidence." But Genevieve was not willing to accept this denial. She could see the truth written all over Mr. Franklin's troubled face, in the way he avoided her gaze, in the tremor of his hands. She took another step towards him, her voice now firm and determined. "Mr. Franklin, please," she insisted, her voice laden with emotion. "I know there is something you are not telling me. I can see it in your eyes. This is no mere coincidence. This man, he is identical to Caleb in every detail, and the birthmark." "How do you explain that?" Nathan, who had remained silent until then, suddenly spoke, his voice small but filled with conviction. "It's true, Grandpa. You had the same smile as Dad, the same way of walking. Even your voice sounded the same." Mr. Franklin looked at his grandson, an expression of pain crossing his face. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Genevieve could see the inner struggle in her father-in-law's eyes, the weight of a long-kept secret threatening to crush him. "Please," Genevieve pleaded, her voice softening. "If there is something I don't know about Caleb, about our family, I have a right to know. Nathan has a right to know. We have lived with this pain, this uncertainty for so long. We need the truth." The old patriarch seemed to be waging an internal battle, his face a mask of conflict and anguish. For a long moment, silence reigned in the kitchen, heavy and oppressive. Nathan watched the scene with wide eyes, sensing the tension in the air but not fully understanding what was happening. Suddenly, to Genevieve and Nathan's surprise, tears began to stream down Mr. Franklin's weathered face. It was the first time they had seen him display such vulnerability. The man who had always seemed so strong, so unshakable, now appeared broken, defeated by the weight of his own secrets. "You're right, Genevieve," he said, his voice broken. There is something you should know. Something I should have told you a long time ago. Genevieve felt her heart skip a beat. Finally, she was about to uncover the truth that had been hidden for so long. She sat down slowly, pulling Nathan close to her, bracing herself for whatever Mr. Franklin was about to reveal. "Please, have a seat," Mr. Franklin said, gesturing to the chairs around the kitchen table. His hands were visibly trembling as he moved to sit down as well. Genevieve and Nathan obeyed, their eyes never leaving Mr. Franklin's anguished face. The old patriarch took several deep breaths, as if gathering courage for what he was about to say. "What I am about to tell you," he began, his voice low and quavering, "is something I have kept secret for many years, something I never thought I would have to reveal." He paused, his eyes moving between Genevieve and Nathan, as if gauging the impact of his words. "It is a story that began long ago, before Caleb was born. A story of wrong decisions and consequences that have haunted us for decades." Genevieve felt her heart rate accelerate. She gripped Nathan's hand, seeking comfort in her son's presence. "Please, Mr. Franklin," she said softly, "tell us everything." Mr. Franklin nodded slowly, his eyes focusing on a distant point as if looking into the past. "Many years ago," he began, his voice low and laced with remorse, "when Caleb was born." But before he could continue, a shrill sound cut through the air, causing everyone in the kitchen to freeze. The unmistakable sound of a gunshot echoed across the mansion's grounds, followed by muffled shouts and the shattering of glass. "My God!" Genevieve exclaimed, instinctively pulling Nathan closer. "What was that?" Mr. Franklin, his face a mask of terror, reacted with surprising swiftness for his age. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair over in the process. "Quick!" he shouted, pushing Genevieve and Nathan toward the kitchen door. "Go to your room, Genevieve. Hide there and don't come out until I say so." Genevieve hesitated for a moment, torn between fear and the desperate need to know the truth Franklin was about to reveal. "But Mr. Franklin," she protested, "what's going on? Who's shooting?" "There's no time for explanations," Mr. Franklin answered, his face pale with fear. "You have to hide now. I'll handle this." Another shot, this one sounding closer, rang out through the mansion. The sound of shattering glass and distant shouts filled the air, heightening the sense of urgency and danger. "Go!" Mr. Franklin yelled, pushing them toward the door. "Now!" Genevieve, realizing the gravity of the situation, finally took action. She grabbed Nathan's hand and ran toward the stairs, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. "Mommy!" Nathan whimpered, his little legs struggling to keep up with Genevieve's frantic pace. "What's happening? Why are there gunshots?" Genevieve had no answers to give her son. She herself was lost in a whirlwind of fear and confusion. As she ran through the mansion's corridors, toward the relative safety of her room, her mind spun with unanswered questions. Who was shooting? Why? And most importantly, what was the truth Mr. Franklin had been about to reveal before the violent interruption? Upon reaching her room, Genevieve locked the door and pulled Nathan into the closet, where they hid among the hanging clothes. In the tense silence that followed, punctuated only by distant sounds of commotion coming from downstairs, Genevieve held her son tightly, trying to calm him and herself. "It's okay, my love," she whispered, stroking Nathan's hair. "We're safe here. Everything will be all right." But as the words of comfort left her mouth, Genevieve couldn't help but think about Mr. Franklin's interrupted revelation. What was the secret he had kept for so long? And how did it connect to the mysterious man from the jewelry store, so alike Caleb? In the dark of the closet, embraced to her trembling son, Genevieve made a silent promise to herself. No matter what happened, she would discover the truth. For Caleb's memory, for Nathan's future, and for her own peace of mind, she would unravel the mystery that seemed to surround the Walker family. The truth will come to light, she thought, her determination growing with every second. And when it does, nothing will be the same. The silence that followed the gunshots was almost as terrifying as the sound of the shots themselves. Genevieve, still embracing Nathan in the dark of the closet, felt every beat of her heart like thunder in her ears. The minutes dragged on, endless, as mother and son remained motionless, fearing that the slightest movement might draw unwanted attention. The air in the closet was growing heavy, charged with their fear and rapid breathing. Genevieve could feel Nathan's body trembling against hers, and it filled her with fierce determination. She needed to protect her son, but she also needed to find out what was going on. "Mum," Nathan whispered, his voice almost inaudible, "do you think it's safe to come out now?" Genevieve hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know, my love, but we have to find out." Carefully, Genevieve pushed aside the hanging clothes and cracked open the closet door. The dim light seeping through the cracks in the curtains revealed the room exactly as they had left it. There were no signs of intrusion or imminent danger. Still, Genevieve felt a tension in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She stepped out of the closet slowly, her eyes scanning every corner of the room for anything out of place. The shadows seemed to move, playing tricks on her already overloaded imagination. "Stay here, Nathan," she instructed, her voice firm but gentle. "I'll see if it's safe." Nathan nodded, his big, frightened eyes fixed on his mother. "Be careful, Mom," he pleaded, his trembling voice betraying the fear he tried to hide. Genevieve approached the bedroom door with cautious steps, every fiber of her being on alert. The carpet muffled her footsteps, but to her fear-sensitized ears every movement seemed deafening. She pressed her ear against the cold wood of the door, trying to catch any sound from the hallway. The silence on the other side was absolute, almost surreal, as if the world beyond that room had ceased to exist. With her heart pounding, she reached out for the doorknob, bracing herself for what she might find on the other side. Her fingers trembled slightly as they touched the cold metal, but when her fingers touched the cold metal, something was wrong. The doorknob didn't turn. Genevieve frowned in confusion and tried again with more force. Nothing. The door was locked. But how? She was sure she hadn't locked it when they had rushed into the room. A chill of fear ran down her spine. Someone had locked them in. But who? And why? "What's wrong, Mom?" Nathan asked, noticing his mother's worried expression. He had moved silently closer, his eyes wide, searching her face for answers. "The door, it's locked," Genevieve replied, her mind racing to understand what was happening. She tried to keep her voice calm, not wanting to frighten Nathan further, but the tremor in her words betrayed her own anxiety. She was about to force the door when she heard something, a sound so low that for a moment she thought she had imagined it, but there it was again, a whisper coming from the other side of the door, a voice she knew well, a voice that should have brought comfort, but that in that moment only heightened her apprehension. "Genevieve." Mr. Franklin's voice was almost inaudible, as if he feared the very walls might hear him. "Don't make a sound. Please stay where you are." Genevieve's heart leapt into her throat. What was Mr. Franklin doing on the other side? Why had he locked the door? And why was he whispering as if his life depended on it? 1,000 questions flooded her mind, but she knew she couldn't ask any of them out loud. The fear in his voice was palpable, something Genevieve had never experienced before from the patriarch of the Walker family. "What's going on?" she whispered back, her mouth almost pressed against the crack of the door, desperately trying to understand the situation. "I can't explain now," came Mr. Franklin's muffled reply, every word laden with tension. "Just stay quiet. Please trust me." Nathan, who had silently drawn closer, tugged at Genevieve's skirt. His eyes were wide with fear and confusion, seeking the reassurance from his mother that he had always found. "Mom, why did Grandpa lock us in?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. A child's fear mingled with the bewilderment of the incomprehensible situation. Genevieve knelt down beside her son, enveloping him in a protective embrace. She wanted to tell him that everything would be all right, that there was nothing to worry about, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she lie to Nathan when she herself was so frightened and confused? The uncertainty of the situation weighed on her like a suffocating blanket. "I don't know, my love," she finally answered, stroking the boy's hair, trying to convey a calmness she didn't feel. "But your grandfather must have a good reason. We have to trust him." But even as she said those words, Genevieve felt a growing unease within her. What could be so terrible that Mr. Franklin needed to keep them locked in and silent? And why couldn't he explain? The interrupted revelation in the kitchen still echoed in her mind, mingling with the unanswered questions about the man at the jewelry store. Everything seemed to be connected somehow, pieces of a dark puzzle she couldn't decipher. On the other side of the door, Genevieve could hear soft movements. The creaking of the wooden floor, the rustling of clothes. Mr. Franklin seemed to be pacing back and forth as if standing guard. But against what? Or against whom? Each sound amplified her anxiety, fueling the terrible scenarios her mind conjured up. "Grandpa," Nathan called softly, his voice laden with concern. The innocence in his tone contrasted painfully with the tension of the moment. "Are you okay?" There was a pause from the other side, a moment of silence that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. And then Mr. Franklin's voice, tense and low, reached them. "Yes, Nathan, everything will be fine. I just need you to be very brave and very quiet for a little while longer." Mr. Franklin's response, though intended to reassure, only increased Genevieve's anxiety. She could feel the fear in her father-in-law's voice, something she had never experienced before. Mr. Franklin had always been the pillar of strength in the family, unshakable and controlled. To see him, or rather hear him, so disturbed was deeply unsettling. What could rattle a man like him to this extent? Genevieve rose slowly, her mind working furiously. She couldn't just stand idly by, waiting for something to happen. She needed to understand, needed to act. Passivity had never been her strong suit, and now, with Nathan's safety at stake, her need to act was even stronger. With renewed determination, she approached the door again. "Mr. Franklin," she called, keeping her voice low but firm, charged with an urgency she could no longer contain. "I need to know what's going on. Why did you lock us in? Who fired the shot? Are we in danger?" There was a long moment of silence from the other side of the door. Genevieve could almost feel Mr. Franklin's hesitation, the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them like a charged cloud about to burst. When he finally responded, his voice was laced with an emotion Genevieve had never heard before, a mixture of fear, regret, and something deeper, darker. "Genevieve, please," he implored, and the vulnerability in his voice was shocking. "There are things I cannot explain right now, things that I never wanted you to know about, but I swear everything I do is to protect you." Mr. Franklin's words only served to heighten Genevieve's resolve. She could no longer bear the secrets, the half-truths. Her entire life in the Walker family had been marked by significant silences, by conversations that ceased when she entered a room, by exchanged glances that carried messages she could not decipher. Now, with Nathan's safety potentially at risk, she could no longer accept being kept in the dark. With a sudden decision, she grabbed the doorknob and began to force it, determined to open it by any means necessary. The cold metal seemed to resist her efforts, but she would not give up. Not now, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. "Genevieve, no!" Mr. Franklin's voice rose in volume, panic evident in his tone. The control he had always maintained seemed to be unraveling in the face of his daughter-in-law's determination. "Please don't open that door." But Genevieve could no longer be contained. Years of doubts, of unanswered questions, of whispered secrets in the corners of the Walker mansion, all of it culminated in this moment. She needed to know the truth, no matter the cost. Nathan's safety, the future of their little family, depended on it. "No more secrets, Mr. Franklin," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with emotion. The frustration of years of forced silence spilled out in every word. "We deserve to know the truth. Nathan deserves to know the truth about his father." She continued to force the door, feeling it give way slowly under her pressure. From the other side, she could hear Mr. Franklin struggling to keep the door closed, his breathing heavy and labored. The physical conflict was a mirror of the emotional clash unfolding between them, years of secrets and untold truths reaching a critical juncture. "Genevieve, for God's sake!" Mr. Franklin shouted, all pretense of silence forgotten in his desperation. The fear in his voice was palpable, almost tangible. "If you open that door, I don't know what might happen." "Mr. Franklin's words froze Genevieve in her tracks. The urgency in his voice, the palpable fear, was something she had never experienced before. It was as if the world had stopped spinning for a moment, time suspended in that instant of imminent revelation. She released the doorknob, stepping back, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had just heard. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, charged with fear and anticipation. "What might happen, Mr. Franklin?" The silence that followed was deafening. Genevieve could hear her own breathing, quick and shallow, mingled with Nathan's silent sobs as he watched the scene with eyes wide with fear. From the other side of the door, Mr. Franklin's silence was almost tangible, laden with secrets and regrets. It was as if the weight of years of lies and omissions had finally become too heavy to bear. Finally, Mr. Franklin's voice reached them, low and defeated. "Genevieve, there are things in this family. Things I'm not proud of. Things I've been trying to keep buried for years. But now it's all coming to the surface." The words hung in the air, heavy and weighted with meaning. Genevieve felt a chill run down her spine, but her determination grew. She couldn't stand to wait for answers any longer. "Enough, Mr. Franklin!" Genevieve shouted, her voice trembling with anger and frustration. "I'm going to break down this door right now. Stand back." "No, Genevieve, please don't do this," Mr. Franklin pleaded, but his plea fell on deaf ears. Genevieve stepped back a few paces, preparing herself. With all the strength she could muster, she began kicking the door violently. The booming of the impacts echoed through the mansion, each strike a declaration of her determination to uncover the truth. "Mommy!" Nathan cried out, startled by his mother's sudden outburst of violence. But Genevieve did not stop. Kick after kick, the door began to give way. The hinges groaned in protest, the wood cracking under the force of the blows. Finally, with a deafening snap, the door burst open. Genevieve stepped out into the hallway, panting and resolute. There stood Mr. Franklin, leaning against the opposite wall, his face a mask of shock and fear. "I demand that you tell me the truth right now," Genevieve declared, her voice steady and threatening, "or my son and I will leave this house, and you will never see your grandson again." Mr. Franklin, looking defeated and older than ever, hung his head. "You're right, Genevieve," he said, his voice weary. "It's time you knew the truth, the whole truth." Mr. Franklin entered the room, his steps heavy and uncertain, as if each movement cost him immense effort. His face, normally a mask of control and authority, was now etched with deep lines of worry and remorse. The haughty posture that had always characterized him seemed to have crumbled, leaving in its place a man bent under the weight of long-held secrets. He closed the door behind him, the click of the lock echoing in the tense silence of the room. With trembling hands he turned the key, locking them inside that space which now felt smaller and more suffocating than ever. Genevieve watched her father-in-law's every move, her heart pounding against her chest, anticipating the revelations to come. "Mr. Franklin," Genevieve began, her voice trembling slightly, struggling to maintain her composure in the face of the patriarch's evident anguish. "What were those gunshots? Are we in danger?" The old patriarch let out a heavy sigh, running his hand through his graying hair in an unusual gesture of nervousness. His eyes, usually steady and determined, now wandered around the room as if seeking an escape from the situation he found himself in. "One of the neighbors said it was a break-in," he replied, avoiding Genevieve's gaze. There was a hesitation in his voice, an uncertainty Genevieve had never witnessed before. "But I fear it might be something else, something related to my past." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous like storm clouds before a tempest. The silence that followed was almost palpable, filled with unasked questions and unspoken truths. Nathan, who until then had observed in silence, clutched his mother's hand, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. The innocence in his gaze contrasted painfully with the gravity of the situation. "What past, Grandpa?" he asked, his voice small and frightened, echoing the doubts Genevieve felt as well. Mr. Franklin looked at his grandson, and for a moment the mask of strength he had always worn seemed to crumble entirely. His features softened, revealing a vulnerability Genevieve had never seen before. It was as if, for the first time, she was seeing the true man behind the Walker name. "Nathan, my boy," he began, his voice choked with emotion, each word seeming to cost him immense effort. "There are things in my life I never wanted you to know, mistakes I made in my youth, for which I am now in my old age paying the price." Genevieve felt a chill run down her spine. The man before her seemed so distant from the father-in-law she knew, the powerful Mr. Franklin Walker who commanded respect and admiration wherever he went. It was as if she were facing a stranger, someone whose life had been carefully hidden behind a facade of respectability. "What are you talking about, Mr. Franklin?" she asked, barely able to contain the tremor in her voice. Fear and curiosity warred within her, part wanting to know the truth, part dreading what that truth might mean for her family. The old patriarch walked slowly to the window, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside, as if he could see the ghosts of his past dancing in the shadows. The faint light filtering through the gaps in the curtains cast dramatic shadows across his aged face, accentuating every line of worry, every mark of regret. "When I was young," he began, his voice low and laden with remorse, the words seeming to be wrenched from some deep place within him, "I got involved with dangerous people, criminals. I incurred debts I couldn't repay." Genevieve felt the shock of those words like a punch to the gut. The image she had of Mr. Franklin, the epitome of integrity and respectability, began to crumble before her eyes. It was as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly vanished, leaving her in freefall. "But how? Why?" she stammered, unable to fully comprehend what she was hearing. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the man she knew with this obscured past he was revealing. Mr. Franklin turned to face them, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The pride that had always characterized him seemed to have drained away, leaving only regret and shame behind. "I was young and foolish," he admitted, the bitterness evident in his voice. Every word seemed to cost him a piece of his soul. "I believed I could handle any situation, but I was mistaken, and that mistake almost cost me everything I loved." Nathan, still clutching his mother's hand, looked back and forth between Genevieve and Mr. Franklin, trying to make sense of the situation's gravity. His innocent eyes sought answers in an adult world that suddenly seemed far more complicated and frightening. "What happened, Grandpa?" he asked, his voice a mix of childlike fear and curiosity. The question hung in the air, weighted with a heaviness that seemed too great for Nathan's small shoulders. Sir Franklin closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength to continue. When he opened them again, they were filled with a pain so deep that Genevieve felt her heart constrict. Despite the shock and confusion she felt, it was the pain of a man who had carried too heavy a burden for too long. "When the twins were born," he continued, his voice almost a whisper, as if fearing the very walls could hear his secrets, "the Montero family, the criminals I owed money to, made a terrible demand." Genevieve felt her heart stop for a moment. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in her mind, forming a picture she could barely comprehend. "The twins," she repeated, her mind reeling from the implications. The memory of the man at the jewelry store, so similar to Caleb, suddenly took on new meaning. "You mean Caleb and—" Sir Franklin nodded slowly, the anguish evident in every line of his aged face. It was as if every word he spoke cost him years of life. "Yes, Genevieve, Caleb had a twin brother, a brother I was forced to give up in order to save their lives." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Genevieve felt as if the ground had disappeared from under her feet. The world around her seemed to have stopped spinning, frozen in this moment of shocking revelation. She looked at Nathan, seeing the shock and confusion in his innocent eyes, and felt a surge of protectiveness and anger rise within her. How could Sir Franklin have kept something like this hidden for so long? How could he have deprived Caleb, Nathan, the entire family, of knowing this truth? "How could you do such a thing?" she demanded, her voice trembling with emotion. Anger and disbelief warred within her, seeking expression. "How could you give away your own son?" Sir Franklin staggered, as if physically struck by Genevieve's words. He leaned against the wall, looking older and frailer than ever. The weight of his secrets seemed to have crushed him completely. "I had no choice," he said, his voice broken, every word laden with decades of guilt and regret. "The Monteros. They couldn't have children of their own. They demanded one of the twins as payment for my debt. When we refused, they threatened to kill them both." Genevieve felt the tears burn her eyes, a mixture of anger, shock, and a profound sadness she couldn't fully comprehend. The magnitude of the choice Sir Franklin had been forced to make was almost incomprehensible. "And you just let them take one of your sons?" she asked, incredulous. The idea of separating two brothers, two souls who had shared the same womb, seemed an unspeakable cruelty. Sir Franklin shook his head, tears now freely streaming down his weathered face. Each tear seemed to carry the weight of years of guilt and remorse. "It was the hardest decision of my life," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it was that, or lose them both. I chose to save one, with the hope of someday being able to get the other back." Nathan, who had remained silent, absorbing it all, finally spoke, his voice trembling but filled with an understanding beyond his years. "So, I have an uncle, Grandpa?" "An uncle I've never met?" Sir Franklin looked at his grandson, a sad smile playing on his lips. Nathan's innocence, his ability to see beyond the pain and guilt to the possibility of a reunited family, seemed to touch something deep within the old patriarch. "Yes, Nathan," he answered softly, a glimmer of hope shining in his tired eyes. "You have an uncle who has lived his entire life without knowing who he truly is." With trembling hands, Sir Franklin reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. The worn leather spoke of years of use, of an object carried not just with money and documents, but with memories and secrets. From inside, he withdrew an old, yellowed photograph, handling it with the care one would dedicate to a sacred relic. He stepped closer to Genevieve and Nathan, holding the image out for them to see. "Look," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This picture was taken the day they were born." Genevieve took the photo, feeling as if she were holding a fragile piece of the past in her hands. The paper was worn at the edges, yellowed by time, but the image was still clear. In the picture, two identical babies slept peacefully side by side, their tiny faces serene, unaware of the fate that awaited them. They both had the same birthmark on their necks. Caleb and his twin brother, united at the beginning of their lives, with no inkling that destiny would cruelly tear them apart. She felt tears stream down her face as she looked at the image, imagining what life might have been like if the family had never been divided in such a way. How many lost moments, how many memories that were never made. "The loss of Caleb was a blow from which I never fully recovered," Sir Franklin continued, his voice heavy with pain. Every word seemed to tear a piece from his heart. "To lose a child is an anguish I wouldn't wish on anyone. And to know that I have another son out there, a son I've never known who doesn't know who I am, it's a constant torment." Genevieve looked up from the photo, meeting Sir Franklin's anguished gaze. For the first time, she saw beyond the facade of the powerful patriarch, seeing only an old man carrying the weight of decades of guilt and remorse. The anger she had initially felt began to give way to a reluctant understanding. Not forgiveness, not yet, but an appreciation of the profound pain Sir Franklin carried. "Sir Franklin," she said softly, choosing her words carefully, "I'm so sorry for everything that happened to you." The old man sighed deeply, passing a hand over his weary face. The gesture seemed to sweep years from his appearance, revealing the vulnerability behind the strength he had always displayed. "I'm 80 years old, Genevieve," he said, his voice trembling slightly. The frailty of his mortality seemed to weigh upon him like never before. "Each day that passes is a reminder that my time is running out. I'm afraid of dying without having known my other son, without having had the chance to ask for his forgiveness." Nathan, who had been listening attentively, stepped forward, his eyes shining with a mixture of confusion and determination. The innocence of his youth allowed him to see a simple solution to a complex problem. "We can find him, can't we, Mum?" he asked, looking at Genevieve hopefully. "We can help Grandpa find his son." Genevieve felt her heart tighten at her son's words. Nathan's innocence and kindness, even in the face of such a shocking revelation, reminded her of how pure and loving her son's heart was. It was a reminder of what truly mattered: family, forgiveness, the chance to right the wrongs of the past. She looked at Mr. Franklin, seeing hope glimmering in his weary eyes. It was a fragile hope, like a flickering flame about to be extinguished. "Genevieve," Mr. Franklin said, his voice barely above a whisper, laden with a plea she had never imagined hearing from the proud patriarch. "I know it's a lot to ask after everything I've just revealed, but could you help me? You met my son today. Could you help me see him again?" The request hung in the air, charged with hope and fear. Genevieve felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She stood at a crossroads, a decision that could forever change the course of their lives. She looked at the photo in her hands, at the innocent faces of the babies who had no idea of the fate that awaited them. She looked at Nathan's face, full of hope and confidence in her ability to fix things. And finally, she looked at Mr. Franklin, a man broken by the weight of his own mistakes, seeking one last chance at redemption. The truth had been revealed, the secrets exposed to the light. Now she had a choice to make, a choice that could change the future of the Walker family forever. Genevieve felt the weight of that decision like a physical burden on her shoulders. She took a deep breath, trying to sort through the whirlwind of emotions that consumed her. "Mr. Franklin," she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil of emotions she felt. "What you've told us it's difficult to process. But if there's a chance to reunite this family, to right the wrongs of the past." She paused, looking at Nathan, who nodded encouragingly. Her son's silent support, his ability to forgive and see beyond the pain, gave Genevieve the strength she needed to continue. With a deep sigh, she turned to Mr. Franklin, her decision made. "I'll help you," she said finally, her voice laced with determination. "I'll help you find your son." Genevieve's words seemed to fill the room with a new energy. Mr. Franklin, who moments ago had appeared on the verge of collapse, straightened slightly, a glimmer of hope lighting his weary eyes. "Thank you, Genevieve," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me. I just want the chance to get things right, even if it's at the end of my life." Nathan, who had been watching the interaction between his mother and grandfather with attentive eyes, suddenly spoke up. "Mom, do you think my uncle will want to meet us? What if he's mad at Grandpa?" Nathan's innocent question brought to the surface a reality that Genevieve had not yet fully considered. How would this man react to the truth of his origins? Would he be capable of forgiving Mr. Franklin, of accepting a family he never knew he had? "I don't know, sweetheart," Genevieve answered honestly, stroking Nathan's hair. "But we have to try. He deserves to know the truth, and you deserve the chance to meet your uncle." Mr. Franklin watched the interaction between mother and son with a mixture of admiration and regret. "You're a wonderful mother, Genevieve," he said softly. "Caleb would have been proud of you and Nathan." Mr. Franklin's mention of Caleb sparked a pang of pain in Genevieve. It was a painful reminder of all they had lost, of all the lies they had lived. But it was also a reminder of why she was doing this. "Mr. Franklin," Genevieve said, turning her attention back to the matter at hand, "I need you to tell me everything you know about the man I saw today. What's his name? Where does he live? What do you know about his life?" Mr. Franklin hesitated for a moment, as if gathering courage to share more details of his shadowy past. "His name is Miles," he finally said. "Miles Harrington. The Monteros raised him as their own son. As far as I know, he lives here in Beverly Hills, but I've never dared to approach him." Genevieve absorbed this information, her mind already working on a plan. "And how do you explain the coincidence of us seeing him at the jewelry store today?" Mr. Franklin shook his head, seeming as perplexed as Genevieve. "I can't explain it," he admitted. "Perhaps fate is finally intervening, giving us a chance to right the wrongs of the past." Nathan, who had been listening intently, suddenly had an idea. "Mom, what if we go back to the jewelry store tomorrow? Maybe he'll come back." Genevieve considered her son's suggestion. It was a simple idea, but it might just work. "That's a good idea, Nathan," she said, hugging the boy with pride. "Let's try that." While they discussed the details of their plan, Genevieve couldn't help but notice Mr. Franklin's gaze. It was a mixture of hope and fear, of anxiety and anticipation. She wondered what was going through the old patriarch's mind. Was he really ready to face the consequences of his past actions? "Mr. Franklin," she said, interrupting his thoughts, "I want you to understand something. If we manage to find Miles, I cannot promise how he will react. You must be prepared for the possibility that he may not want anything to do with you or this family." Genevieve's words seemed to weigh heavily on Mr. Franklin, but he nodded in understanding. "I know, Genevieve," he replied, his voice laden with resignation, "and I will accept whatever decision he makes. I just want the opportunity to tell him the truth, to ask for forgiveness." The morning sun bathed the streets of Beverly Hills in a golden light, but Genevieve barely noticed the beauty of the day. Her heart raced as she approached the jewelry store, the weight of the truth she carried seeming to increase with every step. She paused for a moment before the gleaming window display, her reflection mingling with the sparkle of the jewels on display. She took a deep breath, gathering courage for what she was about to do. "For Caleb, for Nathan, for the truth," she murmured to herself like a mantra that gave her strength. The words echoed in her mind, reminding her of the reason she was there, about to turn a stranger's life upside down. As she entered the jewelry store, The soft tinkle of the doorbells seemed to announce the start of something daunting. The crystalline sound echoed through the elegant space, causing some customers and staff to look her way. Genevieve felt the weight of those gazes, but remained steadfast in her purpose. Her eyes scanned the elegant interior, anxiously searching for the man who was the mirrored image of her late husband. Her heart skipped a beat when she finally caught sight of him. And there he was, Miles, examining a display case of expensive watches, oblivious to the storm about to erupt in his life. Genevieve felt her heart falter as she saw the uncanny resemblance to Caleb again. It was as if past and present collided before her eyes. Every movement, every expression of Miles was a painful echo of Caleb, a living reminder of what she had lost and what could have been. With hesitant steps, she approached Miles. Her hands trembled slightly, and she pressed them against her body to disguise her nervousness. The familiar scent of the cologne he wore, the same one Caleb had always preferred, hit her like a wave, bringing a flood of memories with it. Genevieve had to struggle to maintain her composure. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice steadier than she had expected. Miles turned, surprise evident in his eyes as he recognized the woman from the day before. For a moment, Genevieve saw a flicker of something in his eyes, curiosity perhaps, or a recognition he couldn't quite explain. "I need to speak with you in private. I know that I am not your wife, but there is something about your past that you need to know." Miles frowned, a mixture of confusion and distrust crossing his face. The resemblance to Caleb was even more striking up close, and Genevieve had to fight the urge to reach out and touch his face to make sure he was real. He looked around as if searching for an escape route, his uneasy eyes revealing his discomfort. "Ma'am, I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, his voice tense, laced with an emotion that seemed to go beyond mere annoyance. "I think you're mistaking me for someone else." Genevieve shook her head, determination shining in her eyes. She could feel herself treading on dangerous ground, but she knew she couldn't back down now. The truth was too important, the stakes too high. "No, sir, there is no mistake. Please, I ask only for a few minutes of your time. What I have to tell you may change your life." She paused, watching the internal struggle play out on Miles's face. Every expression, every small movement was so familiar and yet so strange. "I promise that after you've heard me out, if you still wish, I will never bother you again." After a moment's hesitation that seemed to last an eternity, Miles finally nodded, albeit reluctantly. Genevieve could see curiosity warring with caution in his eyes. "All right," he said, his voice still laced with suspicion. "But make it quick. I have business to attend to." The tone of his voice was firm, but there was an almost imperceptible tremor that betrayed his unease. They left the jewelry store and walked in silence to a nearby cafe. The tension between them was palpable, like a taut rope about to snap. Genevieve could feel Miles's occasional glances on her, probably wondering what secrets she could hold about his past. The sound of their footsteps on the sidewalk seemed to echo the quickened rhythm of their hearts. The cafe was a cozy place, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the air, but even the welcoming atmosphere couldn't dispel the tension between them. Seated at a secluded table, away from prying ears, Genevieve took a deep breath, steeling herself to reveal the truth that could forever change Miles's life. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the table. "Mr. Harrington," she began, her voice low but firm. "What I'm about to tell you may sound unbelievable, but I ask that you hear me out until the end." Miles nodded stiffly, his eyes fixed on Genevieve with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She could see the resemblance to Caleb in every line of his face, in every expression, and it made her heart ache. The familiarity was so intense that, for a moment, she almost forgot she wasn't talking to her late husband. "I'm listening," he said, his voice tense, his hands gripping the coffee cup like a lifeline. Genevieve began to recount the story of Mr. Franklin, her voice trembling slightly as she revealed the long-guarded secrets. She spoke of the debts, the Montero family's cruel demand, the impossible decision Mr. Franklin was forced to make. The words poured out of her like a dammed river finally finding an outlet, carrying with them years of secrets and pain. With every word, she could see Miles growing more agitated, his hands gripping the coffee cup so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "You're saying," Miles interrupted, his voice shaking with anger and disbelief, his eyes wide in a mixture of shock and denial. That I was stolen from my real family, that my entire life has been a lie. He rose abruptly, his chair scratching loudly against the cafe floor. The sound echoed through the space, drawing curious glances from the other patrons. "This is madness. You're lying." Genevieve reached out, her eyes pleading for Miles to calm down. She could see the whirlwind of emotions on his face, so much like Caleb's when he was distressed. "Please, Mr. Harrington. I know it's hard to believe, but I swear it's the truth." She paused, carefully choosing her next words. "Did your parents never tell you anything about being adopted?" Miles shook his head violently, his eyes flashing with anger. The denial was evident in every line of his tense body. "No, never. Because I'm not adopted. My parents are my parents." His voice rose, laden with emotion, a mixture of anger and fear that made Genevieve's heart constrict. "This story, it's a cruel lie. Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Seeing that Miles was about to leave, Genevieve made a desperate decision. She stood quickly, blocking Miles's path. Her body moved almost of its own accord, propelled by the urgent need to make Miles understand. "Wait!" she shouted, ignoring the curious stares from the other cafe patrons. Her shout echoed through the space, freezing Miles in his tracks. "I have proof. Look at this picture and your birthmark." With trembling hands, she pulled the photos from her purse. The aged paper felt fragile in her hands, as if the weight of the truth it carried could make it disintegrate at any moment. The first showed two identical babies sleeping peacefully side by side, innocent and oblivious to the fate that awaited them. The second was a photo of the adult Caleb, his familiar smile frozen in time. She held them out to Miles, anxiously watching his reaction. Miles took the photos, his eyes widening in shock at the undeniable resemblance. His hands visibly shook as he looked from the baby picture to the one of Caleb, and then to his own reflection in the cafe window. The color drained from his face as the reality began to set in, his fierce denial giving way to stunned confusion. "No, it can't be," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The shock in his voice was palpable, as if the entire world had been turned upside down in an instant. His eyes fixed on the birthmark visible on the baby's neck in the photo, identical to his own. Instinctively, his hand flew to his own neck, touching the spot where he knew his own mark was. This is impossible." Genevieve felt a flicker of hope as she saw realization beginning to dawn in Miles's eyes. It was as if an invisible barrier was slowly cracking. "It's the truth, Mr. Harrington," she said gently, her voice laced with compassion. "You and Caleb, my late husband, were twins. You were separated at birth due to terrible circumstances, but now you have the chance to know your true family." For a moment, it seemed like Miles was about to accept the truth. His eyes filled with unshed tears, and Genevieve could see the internal conflict on his face. It was as if his entire life was flashing before his eyes, every memory, every moment being re-evaluated under this new light. But then, as if a curtain had been drawn, his expression hardened. The momentary vulnerability was replaced by a mask of cold determination. "No," he said, his voice cold and distant, as if he were speaking from very far away. "This is a lie, an elaborate, cruel lie." He handed the photos back to Genevieve with shaking hands, as if the mere contact with them burned him. "I don't know who you really are, or what you hope to gain by this, but I'm warning you. Never try to contact me again. If you do, I will take legal action." With those words, Miles rose abruptly from the table, the chair scraping against the floor with a jarring sound that seemed to echo the finality of his decision. Genevieve watched powerless as he swiftly exited the cafe, leaving her alone with the photos and the truth he refused to accept. The door closed behind him with a final jingle, as if shutting a chapter of a story that had barely begun. The silence that followed Miles' abrupt departure was deafening. Genevieve remained seated, the photos scattered on the table before her, feeling defeated and confused. She had imagined many scenarios for this encounter, but none ended like this, with such vehement denial and veiled threat. The weight of failure seemed to crush her shoulders, and she fought back the tears that threatened to fall. As she gathered the photos back into her purse, hands trembling and heart heavy, Genevieve couldn't help but wonder what would happen now. Would Miles speak to his family about this strange encounter? Would he seek answers on his own, or bury this revelation deep in his mind, preferring the comfortable lie to the painful truth? The idea that he might simply ignore it all, continue living without knowing his true story, made her heart ache. And how would Mr. Franklin react to learning that his long-lost son didn't believe the story of his origins? The image of the old patriarch, burdened by guilt and remorse, yearning for a chance at redemption, made Genevieve's heart clench even tighter. How could she go back and tell him that his efforts had been in vain? That the son he had lost so long ago remained lost, not by distance but by denial. As she left the cafe, Genevieve felt the weight of failure upon her shoulders. The day that had begun with such hope now seemed bleak and desolate. The streets of Beverly Hills, once vibrant and full of life, now felt cold and indifferent to the unfolding drama. Each step she took towards the Walker mansion felt heavier than the last, but a small part of her refused to give up. A glimmer of hope, faint but persistent, still shone in her heart. Perhaps, she thought, the seed of doubt had been planted in Miles's mind. Perhaps with time he would start to question, to seek answers. The photo she had shown, the identical birthmark, these were evidence that couldn't be easily ignored or explained away. "It's not the end," she murmured to herself, determination shining in her eyes as she walked back home. The words were both a promise and a prayer. It's only the beginning of a long journey towards the truth. Genevieve knew the path ahead would be difficult, fraught with obstacles and doubts. But she also knew that the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way to the healing and redemption that Mr. Franklin so desperately craved, and perhaps, in time, to the reuniting of a long-divided family. As she walked the familiar streets of Beverly Hills, Genevieve couldn't help but think about how life could change in an instant. Just days ago, her biggest concern had been caring for Nathan and keeping Caleb's memory alive. Now she found herself at the center of a family drama that seemed ripped from the pages of a soap opera. The irony wasn't lost on her, and a sad smile played at her lips. "What would you think of all this, Caleb?" she murmured to herself, looking up at the sky as if she might find the answers in the passing clouds. "Would you have wanted to meet your brother? Would you have forgiven Mr. Franklin?" The questions hung in the air unanswered, but somehow Genevieve felt that Caleb would have understood. He had always been the most compassionate, the most willing to forgive. That memory strengthened her resolve. She would carry on for Caleb, for Nathan, and for the family that could be if the truth was finally embraced. As she approached the Walker mansion, Genevieve felt her heart quicken. How would she tell Mr. Franklin about the encounter with Miles? How could she give him hope when she herself felt so disheartened? Taking a deep breath, she entered the grounds, the iron gates clanging shut behind her with a finality that seemed to seal her fate. Mr. Franklin was waiting for her in his study, his imposing figure in stark contrast to the fragility she had witnessed in recent days. His eyes sought hers as she entered, filled with a hope that made Genevieve's heart clench. "Genevieve," he said, his voice trembling with anticipation. "You found him? You spoke with him?" Genevieve nodded slowly, carefully choosing her words. "Yes, Mr. Franklin, I found him. But—" She paused, struggling to find a way to soften the blow. "It didn't go as we had hoped." She then recounted the encounter, each word seeming to weigh a ton. She saw the hope in Mr. Franklin's eyes diminish as she described Miles's fierce denial, his refusal to entertain the possibility of being adopted. When she finished, the silence in the study was deafening. Mr. Franklin looked as if he had aged years in a matter of minutes, the weight of his past mistakes more evident than ever in his stooped shoulders. "So," he finally said, his voice little more than a whisper, "it was all for naught. My son, my Miles, he will never forgive me." Genevieve felt a surge of compassion for this broken man before her. Despite everything, despite the mistakes he had made, she couldn't deny that his remorse was genuine. "No, Mr. Franklin," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "It wasn't for naught. Miles knows the truth now, even if he doesn't want to accept it. The seed has been planted. In time, perhaps." Mr. Franklin raised his eyes, a glimmer of hope shining through his pain. "You believe so?" Genevieve nodded, feeling a newfound determination growing within her. "Yes, I do." We cannot force him to accept the truth, but we can be there when he is ready to do so. Genevieve's words of hope hung in the office air, laden with a silent promise of better days. Mr. Franklin absorbed them like a thirsty man in the desert, his eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and longing. For a brief moment, the weight of years and secrets seemed to dissipate from his shoulders, replaced by a long-forgotten spark of hope. Yet fate, in its cruel unpredictability, had other plans for that afternoon. Suddenly, without warning, Mr. Franklin's face paled, an expression of intense pain contorting his features. His hands flew to his chest, clutching at the fabric of his shirt, as if they could tear out the agony consuming him from within. The contrast between the hope of moments before and the present terror was jarring. "Mr. Franklin!" Genevieve cried out, her voice laden with panic and disbelief. She rushed to his side as the patriarch staggered, his imposing figure crumbling like a house of cards. Genevieve caught him before he hit the ground, his body weight nearly knocking her over. The sudden frailty of the man who had always been the family's bedrock was terrifying. "Nathan, call an ambulance, quick!" The panic in his mother's voice made Nathan freeze for a moment, his eyes wide with fear, fixed on the scene before him. Mr. Franklin, always so strong and unwavering, now appeared fragile and vulnerable in Genevieve's arms. The boy felt the world he knew crumbling before his eyes. "Nathan, please," Genevieve pleaded, her voice quivering with fear and urgency. That seemed to snap the boy out of his stupor, and he ran to the phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the emergency numbers. The minutes that followed were a blur of frantic activity and paralyzing fear. Genevieve held Mr. Franklin, murmuring words of comfort she scarcely believed herself. "It's going to be all right, Mr. Franklin. Hold on, please. Help is on the way." Her words sounded hollow in her own ears, yet she repeated them like a mantra, as if they could, through sheer force of will, keep Mr. Franklin tethered to this world. Each of the patriarch's labored breaths was a struggle, and Genevieve felt as if she were witnessing the fragility of life firsthand. The distant sound of sirens cut through the air, growing louder by the second. Nathan ran to the window, his anxious eyes searching for the vehicle that would bring aid. The sight of the ambulance's flashing lights was like a beacon of hope amidst the storm of fear that enveloped them. "They're coming, Mum," he yelled, his voice a mix of relief and ongoing dread. "The ambulance is here." Within moments, the Walker mansion was invaded by paramedics, their firm, professional voices cutting through the fog of panic that had settled. They worked with efficiency, quickly assessing Mr. Franklin's condition and preparing him for transport. Genevieve watched, helpless, as they fitted an oxygen mask over her father-in-law's face and transferred him to a stretcher. The scene seemed surreal, as if she were watching a movie and not living reality. "Mum, are you family?" one of the paramedics asked, his voice gentle but urgent. Genevieve nodded, unable to find her voice for a moment. The lump in her throat seemed to prevent her from speaking. "Yes, I'm his daughter-in-law," she finally managed, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Can I come with him?" The paramedic nodded, gesturing for her to follow. "Of course. Come on, there's no time to lose." The journey to the hospital was torture. Sitting in the ambulance holding Mr. Franklin's cold, lifeless hand, Genevieve felt torn between the terrifying present and a not-so-distant past. Just hours ago she had been trying to mend a shattered family. Now she feared that family might be irreparably broken by death. The sound of the sirens and the swaying of the ambulance seemed to echo the turmoil in her heart. At the hospital it was a whirlwind of activity. Doctors and nurses rushed back and forth, their urgent voices echoing through the sterile corridors. Mr. Franklin was swiftly taken to the emergency room, leaving Genevieve and Nathan alone in the waiting area, clinging to each other like shipwreck survivors. The smell of disinfectant and the harsh fluorescent lighting of the hospital seemed to amplify the gravity of the situation. "Mom," Nathan whispered, his voice quavering, "is Grandpa going to be okay?" His eyes were filled with unshed tears, the fear evident in every line of his young face. The innocence in his voice contrasted painfully with the seriousness of the situation. Genevieve pulled her son closer, wishing she could shield him from this pain, this fear. "We have to be strong and have faith, my love," she replied, her own voice thick. "The doctors are doing everything they can." The hours dragged on, each minute seeming an eternity. Genevieve alternated between comforting Nathan and desperately trying to reach Miles. She knew it was a long shot, that he would likely ignore her calls after their tense encounter earlier, but she had to try. Mr. Franklin deserved the chance to see his prodigal son, perhaps for the last time. Each unanswered call was like a dagger to her heart, reminding her of the chasm that still separated the family. "Please, Miles," she murmured to the silent phone, tears streaming down her face. "Please, answer. Your father needs you." But her pleas fell on deaf ears, the phone stubbornly remaining mute. The frustration and despair grew with each failed attempt. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a doctor approached them. His face was grave, and Genevieve felt her heart sink even before he spoke. She stood up, pulling Nathan with her, bracing herself for whatever was to come. "Mrs. Walker," he began, his voice soft but serious. "Mr. Franklin's condition is critical. He needs emergency surgery." Genevieve felt as if the ground had disappeared from beneath her feet. The word surgery echoed in her mind, laden with danger and uncertainty. "Surgery," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "How risky is it?" The doctor hesitated for a moment, carefully choosing his words. His hesitation was a sentence in itself, and Genevieve felt her heart constrict. "It's a high-risk surgery, especially considering the patient's age and condition. But without it..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The meaning was clear in his compassionate eyes. Genevieve felt the weight of the decision bear down on her shoulders like a ton of bricks. How could she make this choice? How could she decide between surgery that could kill Mr. Franklin and doing nothing which would certainly kill him? Her thoughts were in turmoil, images of Caleb, Nathan, Miles flashing through her mind in a dizzying confusion. The responsibility was overwhelming. "I need to see him," she finally said, her voice trembling but determined. "Before I make a decision, I need to speak to him." The doctor nodded understandingly. "Of course, but we must be quick. Every minute counts." Genevieve followed the doctor to Mr. Franklin's room, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Nathan held her hand firmly, his presence an anchor in the storm of emotions consuming her. The hallway seemed endless, each step bringing them closer to a reality Genevieve dreaded facing. Mr. Franklin lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller and more fragile than Genevieve had ever seen him. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that beeped and hummed, monitoring every faint beat of his heart. Seeing him like this, so vulnerable, so human, Genevieve felt a wave of compassion that threatened to knock her down. The powerful man she had known for so many years was gone, replaced by this frail, pale figure. To her surprise, Mr. Franklin's eyes slowly opened as they approached. His gaze, though clouded by pain and medication, found Genevieve's with startling clarity. It was as if, even on death's doorstep, he still had something important to say. "Genevieve," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the machines. "Nathan." Genevieve leaned over the bed, gently taking Mr. Franklin's hand. She could feel the frailty of his bones beneath the thin skin, a painful reminder of his mortality. "We're here, Mr. Franklin," she said softly. "The doctors say you need surgery. It's risky, but..." Mr. Franklin interrupted her with a slight squeeze of her hand. His eyes moved from Genevieve's face to Nathan's and back again. When he spoke, his voice was weak, but laden with a serene acceptance Genevieve had never seen in him before. It was as if in the face of death, he had found a peace that had eluded him in life. "God's will be done," he said, each word seeming to cost him immense effort. "If it is my time to depart without seeing my son, so be it." His eyes filled with unshed tears, a sad smile playing on his lips. The mention of Miles made Genevieve's heart clench, reminding her of her failed attempts to reach him. "But if I survive, I promise to make things right this time." Genevieve felt tears streaming down her own face, the enormity of the moment weighing heavily upon her. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Mr. Franklin's courage and resignation were both moving and inspiring. Finally, she found her voice. "We'll do the surgery, Mr. Franklin, and we'll be here waiting for you when it's over." Mr. Franklin gave a slight nod, his eyes already starting to drift closed again. Exhaustion and pain seemed to be pulling him back into unconsciousness. The doctor gently touched Genevieve's shoulder. "We need to take him now," he said softly. As she watched the nurses prepare Mr. Franklin for surgery, Genevieve felt a mixture of fear and hope churning in her chest. The future was uncertain. The outcome of this surgery could change everything. But for now, all she could do was wait, pray, and cling to the hope that somehow everything would be all right. With one last look at Mr. Franklin being wheeled away to the operating room, Genevieve pulled Nathan close, bracing herself for the long hours of waiting that lay ahead. The fate of the Walker family now rested in the hands of the doctors and perhaps a higher power. All that remained was faith and the hope that in the end love and truth would prevail. "Come, my love," Genevieve said softly to Nathan, guiding him back to the waiting room. "Now we can only wait and pray." As they walked, she couldn't help but look back at the closed doors of the operating room, where Mr. Franklin's fate, and perhaps that of the entire Walker family, was being decided. In the hospital waiting room, time seemed to drag with a cruel relentlessness. Genevieve, sitting in an uncomfortable chair, kept her eyes fixed on the doors leading to the operating room, as if her concentration could somehow sway the outcome of Mr. Franklin's surgery. Her hands, clasped in her lap, trembled slightly, betraying the anxiety she desperately tried to hide from Nathan. The antiseptic smell of the hospital, mingled with the faint aroma of stale coffee from the machine in the corner, only intensified the atmosphere of dread. Nathan, on the other hand, couldn't stay still. The boy paced back and forth, his young mind working furiously, seeking a solution to the desperate situation they found themselves in. His footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor, a steady rhythm that seemed to mark the passing of agonizing minutes. Occasionally, he would stop to look at his mother, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination that belied his years. Suddenly, as if struck by a bolt of inspiration, Nathan stopped in front of his mother, his eyes shining with a determination that went beyond his years. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling slightly with pent-up emotion, "we have to talk to Uncle Miles. He has to know about Grandpa." The words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid of losing his courage if he hesitated. Genevieve looked at her son, surprised by the sudden conviction in his voice. She hesitated, remembering Miles's previous rejection and how much it had hurt them all. The pain of that rejection was still fresh, an open wound she wasn't sure she could bear to have reopened. "My love," Genevieve began, her voice soft but weary, the lines of worry on her face deepening. "We've already tried. Miles made it very clear he doesn't want anything to do with us, but Nathan would not be so easily dissuaded. With a determination that reminded her so much of his father, he knelt in front of his mother, taking her hands in his small ones. The contrast between his young hands and his mother's, marked by toil and worry, was striking. "Please, Mom," he pleaded, his eyes filling with tears he bravely fought to hold back. "Let me try. Maybe if he hears me, maybe he'll understand. Grandpa needs us. He needs all of us." Nathan's words hit Genevieve like a bolt, making her realize the wisdom that sometimes comes from the innocence of youth. She looked at her son, seeing in him the same determination and compassion she so admired in Caleb. It was as if, for a moment, the spirit of her late husband was there, speaking through their child. With a deep sigh, she nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the decision on her shoulders. "All right, my love," she said, caressing Nathan's face, feeling the softness of his young skin beneath her fingers. "We'll try together. But first, we need to find out where Miles works." With a newfound mission, a spark of hope kindling in their hearts, Genevieve and Nathan left the hospital, promising the nurses they would return as soon as possible. The fresh outdoor air was a welcome change from the stifling hours in the waiting room. The contrast between the hospital's heavy atmosphere and the outside world, where life carried on as normal, was almost surreal. They hurried toward the jewelry store where they had last seen Miles, their quickened steps echoing on the Beverly Hills sidewalks. The streets were bustling, people coming and going, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the Walker family's life. Nathan held his mother's hand tightly, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. Upon arriving at the jewelry store, they were greeted by a friendly saleswoman whose professional smile faded slightly as she noticed their worried expressions. The glittering gems in the display cases seemed to mock the gravity of their situation. "Excuse me?" Genevieve began, her voice betraying her urgency, the words tumbling out in a rush. "We're looking for a man who was here yesterday. Miles Harrington. It's very important we find him." The saleswoman frowned, trying to remember. Her eyes moved between Genevieve and Nathan, clearly noticing the resemblance between the boy and the man they were seeking. Nathan, impatient and unable to contain his emotion, added, "He looks a lot like my dad. Please, it's urgent. My grandpa is very sick." His young voice quavered slightly as he mentioned Mr. Franklin's illness, the reality of the situation weighing heavily on his small shoulders. The sincerity and emotion in the boy's voice seemed to touch the saleswoman. She looked at them for a moment, as if making a decision, before finally speaking. Her face softened with compassion. "Yes, I remember," she said softly, leaning slightly over the counter as if sharing a secret. "He works at the Harrington Construction Company, a few blocks from here, on Hidalgo Street." With this precious information, a thread of hope amid the despair, Genevieve and Nathan hurried out of the jewelry store, profusely thanking the saleswoman. They ran through the Beverly Hills streets, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The afternoon sun beat down harshly, causing sweat to bead on their foreheads, but they barely noticed the discomfort, focused solely on their mission. When they finally reached the Harrington Company building, an imposing structure of glass and steel rising against the azure Beverly Hills sky, they paused for a moment, catching their breath and gathering courage. Genevieve looked at her son, seeing in him a mix of determination and fear that mirrored her own feelings. "Are you ready, Nathan?" Genevieve asked, her voice soft but firm. Nathan nodded, his expression a blend of determination and nervousness that made Genevieve's heart clench. "Yes, Mom. We have to do this. For Grandpa." With that, they entered the building, heading straight for the reception desk, their footsteps echoing on the marble lobby. The receptionist, a young woman with an efficient look, eyed them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Clearly, they were not the usual type of visitors to this sleek office. After a brief exchange, during which Genevieve had to employ all her powers of persuasion, and Nathan his most imploring expression, the receptionist finally relented and directed them to Miles's office. Stopped in front of the dark wooden door, with the name Miles Harrington engraved on a golden plaque, they exchanged a look, silently encouraging each other. Nathan took a deep breath, his small chest expanding with the effort, and knocked on the door. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet hallway, sealing their fate. "Come in," came Miles's voice from the other side, deep and authoritative. When they entered, they saw surprise and then annoyance cross his face as he recognized them. Miles was seated behind a large desk, papers scattered before him, the perfect picture of a successful businessman. For a moment, the resemblance to Caleb was so strong that it took Genevieve's breath away. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice as cold as ice. "I said I didn't want anything to do with you." Before Genevieve could answer, gathering courage she didn't even know she possessed, Nathan stepped forward. His large, sincere eyes fixed on Miles, with an intensity that made the older man shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Uncle Miles," he began, his voice shaking slightly but gaining strength as he spoke, "I know you don't know us, and that all of this is very confusing for you, but please, you have to listen to us. Grandpa, Mr. Franklin, he's very sick. He's in the hospital, in surgery. He might die." Nathan's words seemed to hit Miles like a punch. For a moment, his mask of indifference wavered, revealing a mixture of emotions, confusion, fear, and perhaps even concern. It was as if, for a brief instant, the truth he was so desperately trying to deny had finally found a crack in his defenses. But then, as if remembering himself, he hardened his expression again, the mask of indifference slipping back into place. "I'm sorry for Mr. Franklin," he said, his voice forcibly neutral, each word seeming to cost him an effort. "But that has nothing to do with me." Nathan, however, would not give up so easily. With tears in his eyes, which he bravely fought to contain, he took 2 photos from his pocket. The photos were a little crumpled, showing they had been handled frequently. The first showed Mr. Franklin in the hospital, pale and frail, connected to various machines. The image was shocking. The contrast between the strong, imposing man Miles had seen at the jewelry store and this frail, vulnerable figure was striking. "Look," Nathan said, his voice choked with emotion, holding out the photo to Miles. "This is what he looks like now. The doctors say he might not survive the surgery." Miles looked at the photo, his expression softening for a moment. It was impossible not to be affected by the image of a man fighting for his life, regardless of the circumstances. But it was the second photo that really shook him. It was an old photo, clearly taken many years ago, the edges yellowed with time. In it, a young Mr. Franklin stood next to a couple that Miles immediately recognized, his adoptive parents. They were all smiling at the camera, looking happy and carefree. The photo was like a window into a past he didn't know existed, tangible proof of a connection he had vehemently denied. "Where did you get this?" Miles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands were shaking slightly as he held the photo, his eyes roaming over every detail as if trying to absorb every pixel of information. Nathan, sensing he was finally getting through to Miles, answered in a soft, almost reverent voice. "I found it in Grandpa's box. He kept it all these years." Miles stared at the photo for a long moment, his mind clearly in turmoil. The evidence before his eyes was undeniable, but accepting the truth would mean questioning everything he believed about his life and identity. The internal conflict was visible on his face, the struggle between deep-rooted mistrust and the newly awakened desire to know the truth about his origins. It was as if two worlds were colliding inside him, and he didn't know which one would survive the impact. Nathan, seeing Miles' hesitation, feeling they were on the cusp of a crucial moment, made one last desperate plea. Tears were streaming freely down his face now, all pretense of strength abandoned in favor of pure emotion. "Please, Uncle Miles," he pleaded, his voice breaking with the intensity of his feelings. "For the love of God, come see Grandpa. It might be your last chance, if he dies without you seeing him, without you knowing the truth." His voice failed, unable to continue, the weight of the situation finally overwhelming his young strength. Nathan's words, laden with pure and sincere emotion, seemed to finally break through Miles's last defenses. It was as if the boy's plea had found a crack in his carefully constructed armor, striking a part of him that had long been dormant. With a deep sigh, he closed his eyes for a moment, as if he were making the most difficult decision of his life. When he opened them again, there was a new determination in his gaze, mixed with fear and uncertainty. "Okay," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I'll go with you to the hospital." The words seemed to cost him an immense effort, as if every syllable was being wrenched from somewhere deep inside him. As he grabbed his coat and car keys, Miles seemed to be on autopilot, as if he still couldn't believe what he was doing. Genevieve and Nathan exchanged looks of relief and hope, hardly daring to believe they had succeeded. The journey to the hospital was made in a tense silence, each one lost in their own thoughts. Miles was driving, his eyes fixed on the road, occasionally glancing at Nathan in the back seat through the rearview mirror. It was as if he was seeing the boy, and the entire situation, in a new light. The car wound through the streets of Beverly Hills, the sun setting on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to symbolize the imminent changes in their lives. When they finally arrived at the hospital, they rushed to the reception, their hearts pounding with anticipation and fear. The familiar smell of antiseptic and the sight of sterile corridors greeted them, a somber reminder of the gravity of the situation. But the nurse's words fell upon them like a bucket of cold water, freezing them in place. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Walker had a complication during surgery. His condition is critical at the moment." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Genevieve felt her legs weaken, and it was only Miles' arm that prevented her from falling. The instinctive gesture of support surprised them both, a silent reminder of the connection that, though denied, still existed between them. Nathan, eyes wide with fear, grabbed his mother's hand, his little body trembling with the impact of the news. "What kind of complication?" Miles asked, his voice firm, involuntarily assuming the role of strength that the family so desperately needed at that moment. The nurse, noticing the anguish in their eyes, softened her expression. "Mr. Walker's heart stopped during surgery," she explained gently. "The doctors managed to resuscitate him, but his condition is very delicate. They're doing everything they can to stabilize him." Genevieve let out a muffled sob, the nurse's words confirming her worst fears. Nathan hugged his mother tightly, as if trying to protect her from the pain with his little body. Miles, on the other hand, stood motionless, his face a mask of shock and confusion. "Can we see him?" Nathan asked, his voice small and trembling, but filled with a courage that moved everyone present. The nurse hesitated for a moment before answering. "We normally don't allow visitors in the intensive care unit, but given the circumstances..." She looked at Nathan's pleading face and Genevieve's devastated expression. "You can see him for a few minutes, but only 2 at a time." Genevieve looked at Miles, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded slightly, taking a step back. "You two go first," he said softly. "I need a moment." As Genevieve and Nathan followed the nurse down the sterile corridors of the hospital, Miles stayed behind, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He found himself suddenly in the middle of a family drama that, until a few hours ago, he believed had nothing to do with him. Now, here he was, anxiously awaiting news about a man who could be his biological father. In the intensive care unit, Genevieve and Nathan were met with a scene that would be etched into their memories forever. Mr. Franklin, the man who had always been the pillar of strength for the family, now looked small and fragile amid the tubes and machines that kept him alive. The rhythmic sound of the heart monitor was the only indication that he was still fighting. "Grandpa," Nathan whispered, approaching the bed cautiously. His small hands gently touched Mr. Franklin's hand. "We're here. Please, you have to be strong." Genevieve, unable to hold back her tears, leaned down and kissed Mr. Franklin's forehead. "Mr. Franklin," she murmured, "we found him. Miles is here. Please, you have to fight. You have to meet your son." Meanwhile, in the hallway, Miles paced back and forth, his body unable to stay still as his mind processed everything that had happened. The photos Nathan had shown burned in his memory, challenging everything he thought he knew about his life. When Genevieve and Nathan returned, their faces marked by tears, Miles felt a lump form in his throat. "How is he?" he asked, surprised by the genuine concern in his own voice. "He's fighting," Genevieve answered softly. I think he's waiting for you, Miles." Miles hesitated, fear and uncertainty evident in his eyes. Nathan, sensing his hesitation, took his hand. "Come on, Uncle Miles. Grandpa needs to see you." With his heart pounding, Miles followed Nathan into Mr. Franklin's room. As he saw the man in the bed, so similar to himself yet a stranger, Miles felt a wave of emotions he couldn't name. With a deep sigh, Miles took the last few steps separating him from Mr. Franklin. As he approached, he couldn't help but notice the striking resemblance between him and the man in the bed. It was like looking into a mirror of the future, a future that until a few hours ago he didn't even know existed. The emotion hit him like a wave, momentarily leaving him speechless. Mr. Franklin, who seemed to be sleeping, slowly opened his eyes as he sensed someone's presence by his side. His gaze, though clouded by pain and medication, immediately fixed on Miles. A flicker of recognition crossed his weathered face, followed by an expression of joy so pure and intense that it made Miles's heart ache. "Miles," Mr. Franklin whispered, his voice hoarse and weak, but filled with emotion. "My son, you're finally here." The words hit Miles like a punch in the gut. He felt his legs weaken and had to lean on the edge of the bed to keep from falling. The reality of the situation, which until then had seemed like a distant dream, suddenly became painfully real. "Forgive me, my son," Mr. Franklin continued, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I love you. I've always loved you." Miles was paralyzed, unable to fully process what he was hearing. Mr. Franklin's words of love and regret echoed in his ears, defying everything he believed he knew about his life and identity. He felt uncomfortable, caught between the desire to comfort this broken man and the need to protect the life he knew. With a visible effort, Mr. Franklin raised his trembling hand, reaching for Miles. Hesitantly, Miles allowed his fingers to intertwine with those of the man he now knew to be his biological father. The touch seemed to release something within Mr. Franklin, and the words began to flow like a long-dammed river. "The Harrington family," he began, his voice gaining urgency, "forced us to give you up. They threatened to kill you and your brother Caleb if we didn't. We had no choice, son. It was the hardest decision of our lives." Miles felt the world spin around him. The mention of his adoptive parents in this context left him dazed. He had always seen them as loving and caring people. The idea that they could be involved in something so sinister was almost inconceivable. "No, it can't be," Miles stammered, his voice shaking with emotion. "My parents, They would never do something like that. Before Mr. Franklin could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway drew everyone's attention. A familiar figure appeared in the doorway, making Miles freeze in place. It was Lillian Harrington, his adoptive mother, looking out of place in the sterile hospital environment with her elegant attire and worried expression. "Mom?" Miles exclaimed, surprise and confusion evident in his voice. "What are you doing here? How did you know I was at the hospital?" Lillian entered the room, her eyes moving nervously between Miles and Mr. Franklin. She seemed to be struggling to find the right words, the weight of decades of secrets clearly visible on her shoulders. "I went to your office," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Your secretary told me everything. About Genevieve and Nathan's visit, about Mr. Franklin being in the hospital. I came as soon as I could." The silence that followed was deafening. Miles looked at his adoptive mother, searching her face for any sign that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But what he saw was only guilt and remorse. "It's true, isn't it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything Mr. Franklin said. It's true." Lillian nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Yes, my love, it's true. And I'm so sorry." Lillian's words seemed to break a dam inside her. She approached Mr. Franklin's bedside, her body trembling with the force of her emotion. "Mr. Franklin," she began, her voice choked, "I know we don't deserve your forgiveness. What we did was cruel and unforgivable, but now I see the error of our ways. You deserve redemption. You deserve to know your son." Mr. Franklin looked at Lillian, his tired eyes filled with a surprising compassion. "I forgive you," he said softly. "I don't want to die holding grudges. Life is too short for that." Miles watched the scene unfold before him, feeling like a spectator in his own life. Everything he believed he knew about himself, about his family, was being shattered before his eyes. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of uncertainties and shocking revelations. "Who am I?" he murmured to himself, the question echoing in his mind like a silent scream. "If all of this is true, who am I really?" As Miles struggled to process the avalanche of emotions and information hitting him, a shrill and insistent sound cut through the air. The monitors connected to Mr. Franklin began to beep frantically, their numbers blinking in alarming red. Chaos ensued in the room. Nurses and doctors rushed in, shouting orders and pushing Miles, Lillian, and Nathan aside. Miles watched, paralyzed with horror, as the medical team fought to stabilize Mr. Franklin. "He's going into cardiac arrest," one of the doctors shouted. "We need the defibrillator now." Miles felt the world spinning around him. In a matter of moments, he had discovered the truth about his origins, gained a biological father, and was now about to lose him again. The cruel irony of fate did not escape him. As the doctors worked feverishly to save Mr. Franklin's life, Miles found himself caught between two worlds. On one side, the family that raised him, represented by Lillian, who sobbed silently by his side. On the other, the family he never knew he had, with Nathan clinging to his leg, crying in fear. In the midst of this turmoil, Miles wondered if he would ever find his place, if he would ever fully understand who he truly was. The life he knew had been turned upside down, and now, with Mr. Franklin fighting for his life before his eyes, he wondered if he would have the chance to find the answers to all the questions flooding his mind. The frantic sound of the cardiac monitors filled the room, a constant reminder of how fragile life was and how quickly everything could change. Miles closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. In that moment, suspended between the past he thought he knew and an uncertain future, he made a silent promise to himself. No matter what happened, he would uncover the truth about who he really was. He owed it to himself, to Mr. Franklin, and to the two families that were now part of his complicated life. The frantic sound of cardiac monitors filled the hospital room, creating a chaotic symphony of beeps and alarms. Doctors and nurses moved with controlled urgency, their tense voices echoing off the stark white walls. Miles, Lillian, and Nathan were pushed into a corner, watching helplessly as the medical team fought to save Mr. Franklin's life. Time seemed to drag, each second an eternity of uncertainty and fear. The air was thick with tension, almost palpable, as everyone held their breath, waiting for a miracle. Charge to 300, the lead doctor shouted, his hands gripping the defibrillator paddles firmly. Clear! Mr. Franklin's body arched on the bed with the shock, and for one terrible moment, the line on the monitor remained flat. Miles felt his heart stop, fear freezing his veins. He barely knew this man, but the idea of losing him now, when he had finally discovered the truth, was unbearable. His hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms as he fought the urge to run to the bedside. "Come on, Mr. Franklin," Miles muttered, his voice choked with emotion, almost like a prayer. "Don't leave us now. Not when we've finally found each other." As if answering Miles's silent plea, the monitor began to show signs of cardiac activity. Slowly, the rhythm stabilized, the beeps becoming more regular and less frantic. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the room, the tension dissipating like morning fog under the sun. The doctor's shoulders visibly relaxed, and a weary but triumphant smile spread across the lead doctor's face. "We've got him," he announced, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "He's stable for now." Miles felt his legs weaken, the adrenaline leaving his body in a sudden rush. He leaned against the wall, feeling the cool plaster against his back, a reminder of the solid reality surrounding him. Lillian placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Her touch, once so familiar and comforting, now felt strange, laden with the weight of recent revelations. "He's strong, my love," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Just like you. Just like all the walkers." Lillian's words hit Miles like a bolt of lightning. Walker. He was a walker. The reality of his true identity, which until then had seemed like a distant dream, suddenly solidified. He looked at Mr. Franklin, now sleeping peacefully, the monitors showing stable vitals. This man, who only hours ago was a stranger, was now his father. The magnitude of that realization hit him with full force, momentarily robbing him of breath. With hesitant steps, Miles approached the bed. He studied Mr. Franklin's face, noting the similarities he had previously ignored. The curve of the nose, the line of the jaw, it was like looking into a mirror of the future. With trembling hands, Miles took Mr. Franklin's hand, feeling the frail, weathered skin beneath his fingers. It was a physical connection to a past he never knew he had, a bond of blood that transcended time and distance. "Dad," he whispered, testing the word on his tongue. It sounded strange and familiar all at once, like a long-forgotten melody. "I'm here. I won't leave you." As if responding to Miles's touch and words, Mr. Franklin's eyes slowly opened. His gaze, though clouded with exhaustion, met Miles's with surprising clarity. A small smile curved his lips, illuminating his tired face. It was a smile filled with love, regret, and hope, an expression that spoke volumes without saying a word. "Miles," Mr. Franklin murmured, his voice hoarse and weak but charged with emotion. "My son, forgive me for everything." Miles felt the tears he had held back for so long finally spill over. He squeezed Mr. Franklin's hand, leaning closer, as if he wanted to absorb every word, every moment. "There's nothing to forgive, Dad," he replied, his voice trembling with restrained emotion. "You're here now. We're together. That's all that matters." At that moment, the door to the room opened and Genevieve and Nathan entered hesitantly. Their faces were etched with concern and hope. Nathan immediately ran to the bedside, his wide eyes fixed on Mr. Franklin, a mixture of fear and childlike joy on his young face. "Grandpa," he exclaimed, his voice a blend of relief and childlike joy. "You're okay." Mr. Franklin smiled at his grandson, extending his free hand to ruffle the boy's hair. The gesture was full of tenderness, a stark contrast to the strong and sometimes distant man he had been. "Yes, my little one," he replied softly, his voice gaining strength. "Thanks to all of you. Thank you for bringing my family back to me." Genevieve approached, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked at Miles, a hesitant smile on her lips. There was a mixture of emotions in her eyes, joy, relief, and perhaps a touch of wistfulness for Caleb. "Welcome to the family, Miles," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "Caleb would be so happy to know you're finally here." Genevieve's words struck a deep chord within Miles. Caleb, the brother he never knew, but whose absence had shaped his entire life. He nodded, unable to speak, emotion clogging his throat. In that moment, he felt the weight of his family's history, the joys and tragedies that had brought him to this point. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments. Mr. Franklin recovered quickly, his strength renewed by the love and support of his newly reunited family. Each day brought new discoveries, new connections being forged between people who were strangers just weeks before. When he was finally discharged from the hospital, it was with the promise of a new life waiting for him. The Walker mansion, once a place of secrets and sadness, now vibrated with a new energy. Nathan's laughter echoed through the hallways. Mr. Franklin's deep voice mingled with Miles's younger tone in lively conversations, and Genevieve's smile illuminated every room. It was as if the house was awakening from a long slumber, coming back to life with the energy of its reunited family. Miles, who had initially felt out of place in this new world, soon found his footing. He and Nathan formed a special bond almost immediately, the boy enamored with his new uncle and eager to share all his stories and dreams. The afternoons often found them in the garden, Miles pushing Nathan on the swing or teaching him to play soccer, their laughter mingling with the birdsong. "Uncle Miles," Nathan would often say, his eyes shining with excitement, tugging on his uncle's shirt sleeve to get his attention. "Can you tell me another story from when you were a kid? What was your life like before?" And Miles, feeling a surge of affection for this nephew he barely knew but already loved deeply, would always smile and begin another tale. Sometimes they were stories of his childhood with the Harringtons, bittersweet memories of a life that now seemed to belong to someone else. Other times, they were stories Mr. Franklin told him about Caleb, filling in the gaps of a life he had never known but was now a part of. Each story was a thread, weaving a rich and complex tapestry of his newly discovered identity. Mr. Franklin, in turn, seemed to blossom in Miles's presence. He spent hours conversing with his newly found son, eager to make up for lost time. They talked about everything: Miles's hopes and dreams, Mr. Franklin's memories, the years of separation that now seemed like a distant nightmare. Often these conversations took place in Mr. Franklin's study, a room that had once been a symbol of his loneliness and was now becoming a place of connection and healing. "I never thought I'd have this opportunity," Mr. Franklin said one day, as he and Miles strolled through the mansion's gardens, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the well-manicured grass. His voice was thick with pent-up emotion, decades of regret and hope mingled in every word. "To watch you grow, to see the man you've become, missing all of that was the greatest pain of my life, but now having you here, it's more than I ever dared dream." Miles looked at his father, feeling a surge of love and compassion that surprised him with its intensity. He saw not just the strong, powerful man Mr. Franklin presented to the world, but the father who had suffered, who had made mistakes but who had never stopped loving his lost son. "I'm here now, Dad," he replied softly, placing a hand on Mr. Franklin's shoulder. "And I'm not going anywhere. We have all the time in the world to get to know each other." One afternoon, as the family gathered in the living room, the fire crackling in the fireplace and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air, Mr. Franklin rose from his favorite armchair, his posture erect and his eyes shining with a newfound vitality. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice strong and clear, so different from the weak whisper in the hospital. "And I want to thank all of you, especially Genevieve and Nathan, for your persistence and love. Without you, Miles and I would have never been reunited." An emotional hush fell over the room. Genevieve and Nathan exchanged looks of surprise and gratitude while Miles gazed at his father, deeply touched. Mr. Franklin's words were more than a simple thank you. They were an acknowledgement of the crucial role Genevieve and Nathan had played in bringing the family together. "Genevieve," Mr. Franklin continued, turning to his daughter-in-law with glistening eyes, "your strength and determination brought us to this moment. And Nathan," he smiled at his grandson, "your pure heart and unwavering faith taught us the true meaning of family love." In that moment, looking at the emotional faces of his family, Mr. Franklin, his eyes brimming with gratitude, Genevieve tears of joy, Nathan practically bouncing with delight at the recognition, Miles felt a wave of peace wash over him. For the first time in weeks, since his life had been turned upside down, he truly felt at home. "Thank you, Dad," he replied, his voice thick with emotion, a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you, all of you, for accepting me, for giving me a family I never knew I needed." And so, in the warmth of that Mexican afternoon, Miles Walker finally found his place in the world. The past, with all its pains and secrets, was not forgotten, but forgiven. And the future, once uncertain and frightening, now shone with promise and possibilities. The Walker family, once torn apart by tragedy and deception, was now united, stronger than ever. And at the very center of it all was love. The love of a father for his lost son, the love of a son for a family he never knew he had, and the love that can heal even the deepest wounds of the past. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, filled with valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.